So it's now 7 o'clock, so we'll open the March 15th meeting of the Board of Health by roll call vote.
Okay, Daryl Beardsley present.
Matt Beavers present.
Lisa present.
Matt Vitale present. I think we've got a 7:50. So do I have a motion to amend the agenda with 2 items, the nomination of animal inspector and the Mass DEP notice of responsibility?
I'd also like to add, yesterday, EPA came out with what they're expecting will be the new PFAS standard. So,
If you want me to cover that, I can.
That would be fabulous.
Yeah, that'll take like 1 minute. But again, it's only proposed and it's draft out for public
Right.
comment and it's not promulgated and it, so et cetera.
okay, so there's only about 3 more seconds to say on that. So,
So why don't we amend the agenda and then transition to that? So it sounds like we've got a 3rd item, the EPA PFAS. So do I have a motion?
So moved.
so moved. Second,
Hearing no further discussion.
Daryl, I.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Matt Vitale, aye. And with that, let me pass the virtual baton to Lisa.
Sure. So yesterday, EPA came out with proposed drinking water standards, known as maximum contaminant levels or MCLs for 6 PFAS constituents. For PFOA and PFOS, the proposed MCLs would be 4 parts per trillion for each one of them. And then they, for the other 4 they're proposing to regulate, which includes PFNA, PFHXS, PFBS, and what we usually call Gen X, which was supposed to be a substitute for PFOA and PFOS. The combined total of them can't result in a hazard index above 1, which is a sort of different way of regulating it. So basically you have, they came up with sort of these health concentration levels for each one of those 4. So you would divide the detected concentration for each one of them by their respective health-based concentration. And then you would add those numbers together. And if the health-based concentration was, if the mixture exceeds 1, that means basically that, the health-based concentrations were either approached or exceeded for, either a combined amount or an individual one of those 4. So it's a little bit different than just saying the number is X, because you're looking at a combined mixture for those 4. So I think they ended up being pretty similar to, at least for PFOA and PFOS. I was predicting between 1 and 8. So 4 is pretty, I guess it wasn't super surprising to me. And the current standard in Massachusetts is 20 parts per trillion for a sum of 6 PFAS, including PFOA and PFOS. So depending on what you had detected, it may or may not be, it's very stringent. Right now, the Massachusetts is that combined value is the most stringent in the country. So more to come. But like I said, these are just proposed. They are out for public comment, and so they have not yet been promulgated. And so the way it would need to happen is they would have to decide if, after receiving comments and discussions, whether they're going to adjust or modify any of those proposed standards. Then they would need to promulgate them. And then after they're promulgated, Massachusetts would adopt them. Because that's what Massachusetts does. You have the right to be more stringent, but you have a minimum obligation to be as stringent. So basically, Massachusetts will just need to revise their PFAS regulations, because the 6 that Massachusetts is regulating right now, those don't match up with the 6 completely. Those don't match up precisely with the 6 that EPA is proposing. So I would anticipate Massachusetts is already working on revising their regulations and, stay tuned.
So just a quick question. I thought there were a few states that already had gone to 1 and 2 part per trillion.
Yeah, but
For-
ours is 6 for 20, Daryl. So that's why I'm saying you can't compare solo to single to single. And most of them are not. Most of them are still on this on 8, 13, 12. I don't think any state has finalized. A lot of them have drafts out right now, but I don't know of anyone that's promulgated 1 part per trillion as a state, but that's their prerogative. And everyone should understand too that the toxicity values that EPA was relying on for these proposed standards are 10 to I think 1,000 times higher than the ones for the health advisories, which are not enforceable standards and very controversial tox values, I may add. So we'll stay tuned on that, but yeah, they're low numbers. They're tiny.
And I'll mention that there's certainly consideration of regulating this as a class of chemicals, because what happens with, say, the Gen X, there were certain, the handful, the 6, 7, I think now, that have been formally studied and toxicity assessments done. But because there are so many variations, what happens is one gets identified as a problem and you just add a few more molecules to the chain of the PFAS. And now you've got something new that requires being studied.
Actually,
so there is
usually a
talk
few less,
about
Daryl.
doing what?
They usually take off. They don't add. They usually go to a shorter chain versus
All right. Change it. Well, some things add, some of them are longer. They're not all shorter, but anyway. So that may be on the horizon at some point. They're working on the test procedures for the total organic fluorine content as another way of measuring. And,
yeah, although that's not.
So this will be an ongoing.
Always, yeah.
Moving toward.
Definitely.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Lisa. I think one other thing we can fit confidently, I think in the 5 minutes, do I have a motion to approve the March 1st minutes? I submitted some trivial edits, but didn't have any substantive edits.
I have to abstain. I wasn't there.
And I did the same as you, Matt. So
Yeah, I
I'm
don't
fine
think
with
I had anything
approving.
either substantial.
Perfect. So do I have a motion to approve?
So moved.
Seconded.
Hearing no further discussion.
Daryl, I.
Matt Beavers, aye.
I have to abstain.
Matt Vitale, aye. Let's see if I can get to the Kim Morrow renewal. I guess I don't have to have the letter up. Ellen, do you want to just introduce the background for this? It's just our annual renewal of Kim Morrow's animal inspector.
Yeah, every year you have to nominate an animal inspector. You nominate them and they are approved by the state. So it's just that's the form I'll send. If you nominate Kim, I'll send it to her. She'll have to bring it to the town clerk, have her signature notarized. She'll send it to the state, and the state will then send me a certificate that she has to keep with her when she does her inspections.
Perfect. And as far as we know, Kim Morrow wants to continue to be nominated.
Yes, she does.
Oh, good. Well, with that, do I have a motion to nominate Kim Morrow to be the inspector of animals?
So moved.
Seconded.
Second.
Hearing no further discussion.
Daryl, I.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Matt Vitale, aye. Let's try to get to the DEP notification. And if we run out of time before the 7:15, we can revisit. I think this is anyone with more content expertise, feel free to respond, but I think these are ones we've seen before, which is just if there's a release, there's a required notification to let us know about it. And this is one such release.
Yeah. I think, do you know, do you know what it was, Daryl? I didn't have time to.
No, I have not read it, but more to come.
And
Yeah,
it's-
it's usually petroleum with
Yeah,
them,
like a
but
transformer.
yeah, probably.
And I assume they've identified whether it's PCB bearing, but I haven't read through it yet.
Hope not.
Perfect. And perfect. Okay. Okay. We're doing great. I don't know, we've got 4 minutes to the board review. So maybe I can just add a quick comment to orient us to the regulations under chairs business in that 4 minutes. So tonight we'll go over regulation 2 and 3. Ellen provided the updated language to kind of delineate each change as a category so that we can sort of look at them individually. We did have a chance to meet with town council to get feedback on the draft regulations that we'd previously produced. And the recommendations of council, I think, are reflected in the content we have and some of the questions we'll talk about tonight. So I think that we were able to get that feedback. And I think that we'll send them the final version after this discussion to kind of get the final green light, but did get, I think, pretty clear guidance that was helpful. Joe, I don't know if you have anything that you want to add to that.
No, I think that captures it. It was really, I think we made like tiny tweaks, nothing major.
And I think it did flag a couple of areas that I'm hoping we can focus on a little bit more tonight. I think my goal for tonight is primarily a discussion within the board, just because we can't have a discussion another way. But if there are strong feelings of public comments, particularly those of a technical nature, would welcome those inputs as well when we get to that stage. But I think the overall goal is to provide a venue for the board to discuss those based on the feedback of council and those pieces.
We could mention the septic 101.
Oh yeah, perfect, Daryl. Fire away.
Oh, all right. Well, Groundwater Protection Committee had arranged similar to the well presentation that was done some number of months ago to have a septic 101, but it was scheduled for Tuesday night. And the primary presenters for that were in Western Mass and lost power. So they had to postpone. I haven't seen something come through yet, an email about a new date. Tom, have you heard about anything, or we're still?
We haven't picked that yet. Stay tuned.
Okay.
Thanks.
Perfect. So it's now 7:14. So we've got the 7:15 agenda item, which is a review and discussion by the board of the letter by Brian Moore from February 8th. There's a follow-up communication this week as well. This is not, as I sort of previously communicated to Mr. Moore, this is a venue for the board to be able to acknowledge receipt, not necessarily a venue to have a broader discussion about it. I think I can comment on a couple of the questions that were raised because I actually don't think the board is the regulatory body that's responsible for some of the key questions. I want to make sure that we provide direction about sort of who may be more appropriate. So I think the key concern that was defined in the letter was the closure of the drainage pipe. In the letter, it was noted that the board had not deliberated on this, which is true because it's not in our jurisdiction, nor was it kept at our request. My recommendation would be the concerns be followed up with the select board and DPW, since the Board of Health doesn't have jurisdiction of the management of roadway water, those culverts or those pieces. I think for the other parts of it, there's not a new review before the board, and any comments about the 40B should be addressed in that process when there's an application, and the ZBA will ultimately be the ones to consider those. And so for considerations about the runoff and the surface water and those pieces, I think probably falls within that framework and within the ZBA framework. Daryl, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that or anything that you see differently.
Yeah, just a little. When before the drain that fed, the pipe that fed the open drain was closed off, that was an element that we considered when we were reviewing some plans and had noted that. But with the closure of it, we have no clear information about what the dynamic would be when there's not the source of water discharging to that. And so we haven't, I've gone by there since after rainstorms and haven't seen anything. And we did receive some pictures of the pond elsewhere and also of a path. But I believe that that path is farther to the east. So it's between the pond and Lake Street. So it's not anything that's in our jurisdiction for any kind of project.
And I think that the other point I would make is there's a granted permit. So, that permit process has played out. It was an application without variances, was discussed, considered, appeal was raised, like all those steps happened. And so, from a question of how is water managed, which appeared to be a large part of the substance of the communications, I do think there's certainly, I'm agnostic as to whether there's a concern there. I don't live there, I don't look at it, but I think to follow it up would be DPW or select board. For any questions about wetlands, I think that would also fall outside of our jurisdiction in terms of whether changes in that flow created new wetland areas is again, not a board issue. But I would encourage the abutters to raise these issues with the ZBA when that 40B proposal moves forward. And I think that's probably the next time that can be addressed in the context of the impacts of whatever the proposed wastewater management are.
I'll also note that the flooding on the pathway that was shown in one photo is something that I've seen periodically over the 28 years I've been in town and hiking trails. So
I was just going to add that there was literally a river down my street on Western Ave yesterday. Huge ponding. There's still huge ponding right next. So anytime we've had a lot of precipitation, I see the same or similar types of flooding and groundwater seeps and, open current water flowing along the edge. So unfortunately, with a high water table and lots of wetlands, I think a lot of us are dealing with this kind of water.
And it's been an extraordinary rain event. So Matt Beavers, you'd be interested to know that the beaver deceiver is not even visible at the moment. There's so much water.
I believe it because I will say there's more water on Coolidge Street than I've ever seen also. So this has been it was a wet day yesterday.
But until we have evidence of there being water present in an open
but I would even say
then there's nothing for us.
But I would even say separate from if there's water present in an open ditch, that's not a standard we apply to kind of go to different properties to say, do you have water? Like there's a granted permit that was reviewed and granted. I think the question that remains outstanding is the stormwater or surface waters on farm adequately dealt with in the context of the culvert being blocked? And I think that's a question that's out of our purview. And again, I think probably DPW would be the best follow-up. I would say that I'm aware of no request made by the Board of Health on management or how to manage those drains. And so the absence of a public hearing to that effect, again, that's not a decision that was made by us. If there's no other comments by the board on that topic, we'll kind of cycle into the meat of our night tonight, which is looking at the regulatory review. So before I kind of close that topic, any other comment, and then I'll dive into the regs. Perfect. All right. Let me just stop sharing for a second. And then I thought we could go, Ellen had done the, just stop sharing for a second and go into those. Ellen had done an outstanding job summarizing the 32 proposed regulatory changes in sections 2 and 3. And so I thought we could just go through those tonight. Within one of those sections, Lisa's hopefully provided some suggested language that we can incorporate. I think our goal for tonight is to make sure that it passes the gut check. I think the area of public comment that would be most helpful, and at least was my experience in the last our last cycle of public hearings, is there's often unique individual expertise where what I remember most vividly was the person who, I can't remember what the title was, but the graveyard role, who had strong commentary about the amount of ledge disruption that's required to dig a Sherborn grave in some circumstances, and that the initially proposed level was enough that you'd need notification of ledge disruption for grave digging. And then there was an extended discussion of how one would notify the abutters in that circumstance. So if you have technical expertise where you say this doesn't make a lick of sense because of the things I know, those are the areas that are most helpful for public comment. Though if there are questions or clarifications, those are certainly fine as well. I'd ask that you hold those until after the board has completed kind of its point, and raise your hand, and I'll sort of call you as we get through, and we'll resolve it before we move to the next proposed change. Does that sound okay to the board?
Yes.
Yes.
Perfect. All right, let me, let's see, am I sharing my screen? I'm moderately confident that I'm sharing the right screen. Are you guys seeing the proposed regulation changes?
Yep.
Yes.
And Ellen, is it okay if I just go through these one at a time?
Yes, that's what you should do.
Perfect. That works out well. I think Ellen had flagged a couple of points that I will try to catch along the way, but Ellen, I'll also invite you, if I miss one, to flag that, because I think they were all great points that had been raised. So, and sorry, let me just zoom this out. Is that still appropriately visible on the screen to the average set of attending eyes? All right. So regulation, the first change is amending the title of the section to plans and adding clarifying section and language to subsection 3.4.1G. So for folks who have not looked at these before, the text in bold is text that's being added, or new text, and text is in italics is text that's being removed. So we added the clarifying language sewage system design plans here. And then we flagged that the soil logs would be provided by a soil evaluator. The remainder of this is describing the requirements for a septic system plan in terms of what should be included. I thought the proposed changes there look reasonable and just involved kind of an update in the name and as provided by the soil evaluator for the soil logs. Any other discussion by the board?
No, not for me.
See, 1 down, 31 to go. We're flying over here. And so for this one, we've got a little bit more that was defined here. By way of background, this section is describing the application process. All of the text included in section B essentially reflects our chronic patterns of practice in terms of how Ellen and Mark have sort of managed this process over the years. The goal of adding it to the regulations is to make it more visible to a homeowner or a property owner to understand kind of what comes next and what that process is. So the septic system plan requirements have a 45-day timeline that is driven by the state. And so if we don't act within that time period on a complete application, the application is approved by default. So that's a state rule, not a Sherborn rule. What we're doing here is to define what complete means. And so Mark, do I have all that right? You're on mute, but it means you're not.
Sorry. Yeah, no, I hit the wrong button. That is correct. I was just going to say that within the state code, if the plan came in with and wasn't ready for approval, even if the 45 days expired, it still cannot be approved. So if someone picked it up and reviewed it and found fault with the plan, the state has indicated to me in many instances that that plan cannot be approved. So just in case, it's not an automatic approval, it's just a process.
I appreciate that clarification. So again, a sort of properly constituted plan. So a plan that was incomplete, inappropriate, inaccurate, incorrect wouldn't start a 45-day clock. It's really on achieving that point of completion that starts the meter. And for us, this is our opportunity to help define for the applicant what that looks like in the town of Sherborn. This again reflects decades of Sherborn practice. And so this is just articulating the established practice and workflows that have been in place. So it requires a completed disposal works construction application. And then Daryl, if I'm, my share screen is periodically sort of disappearing. So if there's a hand up and I miss it, if you can help keep track of that, it would be much
Okay.
appreciated.
Yep.
I think I'll be able to maintain it. I'm just not totally confident. So this requires a completed disposal work construction application form, plans that we described, which is the plans, the kind of plan requirement that was addressed above, a written copy of an administrative approval, negative determination of applicability or order of conditions from Concom pursuant to the application being submitted, a permit approving the suitable source of water supply pursuant to Regulation 2 domestic water supply, or complete application for the same as defined therein. For a replacement system where the well is not being affected, this requirement is waived. And in those instances where an EHIR is required, an EHIR should be submitted in order for the application to be considered complete to start our period of 45 days in which the review must be completed. And so I think the other piece here just explains some of the rationale is that given the degree to which considerations of well and septic are paired, our experience as a board has been that pairing those applications and processes is the most appropriate and saves significant duplicative time and effort, either on behalf of the board or on behalf of the applicant. So that's why they're required to run in parallel. Again, that will largely affect new construction or construction where substantial changes are happening, where a well is being recited for building considerations or something else, and the septic system is being replaced. It's much more common for us to have a replacement septic system with an established well. And then we just have, I think, kind of language updates in section C to clarify the language and bring it into sync with other language in our regulations. And then I think that we'd previously had some discussion and want to just make sure that stamp and signature are on all on the plans, which again, like generally not an issue, but just to be clear that the plans need to be stamped and signed by the engineer. Any further discussion of this one?
I just want to mention it's not specifically to this, but for people who feel like, gee, we have these changes and we're kind of going through it quickly. If they haven't been at prior meetings, we have been discussing these for what, 5+ months now?
Yeah.
So this is our final version. So that's why we're able to zip through at this point.
And I just want to comment that I don't know if you'll be doing it at the very end but the board needs to vote that this is the final version that you will want. And then there'll be a public hearing where the public can comment on the proposals.
Ellen, I suspect we'll have some sections that have edits in our review tonight. Is it best for us to vote on them change by change? So that, because I sort of worry that.
Yeah, if there'll be additional changes, unless you say that you can vote on it with any other changes that you make tonight.
What would your recommendation be? To vote piecemeal or to vote in mass?
I don't know. I like it both ways because
Why don't we do an
individually? I have to do a roll call vote for everyone.
Why don't we vote in aliquots of 10?
That sounds good.
Okay.
Does that work? Or Matt, if you have another suggestion.
I think it's reasonable I think it's probably reasonable to vote on them all or to go through it and then go back and decide if there are sections we could vote on and sections we can't.
Okay.
Yep.
That makes sense.
Yep. Sounds good. Perfect. So we've done section 1, we've done section 2. It sounds like we all feel good. For number 3, we're just removing domestic from water supply. Since all of our regulations apply to water supplies, like don't differentiate water quality for wells for domestic use or non-domestic use. So to remove any confusion, to take out that descriptor.
That makes sense.
For the change number 4, regulation 2, domestic water supply. Again, this is kind of similar to what we just described in change 3, which is that it is removing the requirement for human occupancy and saying where water will be used. No building permit shall be issued for the construction of a building which would necessitate the use of water therein unless a suitable supply of water is available from a well located on the property where the building is to be constructed. I guess one question I had here is I think this is a very acceptable rule for the vast majority of circumstances. How do we handle it if we have a one-off? So for example, I remember, I don't think it's the case anymore, but there were like 3 or 4 houses on the Framingham border that had water service from a water line associated with MCI, if I remember right. So if one had a building permit there and there was an alternative water supply, it seems like that would be permissible. My question for Ellen was whether we could address that. You know, if this is a requirement where we say, hey, this is required, but somebody said, oh, actually, I'm one of those 3 MCI houses, or there's a different structure at some point in the future that allows for, you know,
Could we just add private, or, you know, or like, so it says the use of water therein, or we could say, accepting if a public water supply is available or something, or you think it's just fine because it captures like 99.5%?
So I think one way that you could do it is to just stop the sentence at unless a suitable supply of water is available.
Yeah.
And just take out that last sentence or that last clause of like is available from a well located on the property.
Well, we've had
no,
questions historically about properties wanting to share. You know, somebody's well went bad and they want to connect to their neighbors, and then the long-term viability of that comes into question.
How about this is available from a public water supply or a well located on the property?
I mean, I guess my question
those are really the only.
Yeah, but we have a semi-public water supply language that we're adding, which
no, that's not the same as public. I'm saying public water.
No, but my point is like that is not a public water supply, nor is it a well located on the property. So our language for a semi-public water supply could include permittable scenarios where you had a semi-public water supply that had 3 houses served, like an open space subdivision, something else that would neither be a public water supply nor
would necessitate the use of water from the property.
I mean, I think it's. Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say. I mean, I was going to say the same thing as Lisa, but I mean, could we say from well located on the property, comma, a semi-public water supply or a public water supply?
Yeah, we can do that, or we can.
And then Ellen has her hand up also.
Okay, go Ellen. You're smarter than all of us. So.
I was just going to say there's so few houses that couldn't, and they're existing. So couldn't it just be a variance?
Well, I think it becomes
be allowed by variance through a variance. They could just.
I think I'd be okay with that. I guess for me, the thing I think about is if we think about something like our open space subdivision or something else where we want to make this accessible as a town, to say, how do we kind of cluster this to preserve open space? I could picture a world where somebody would say, hey, the semi-public water supply option is great. Can I get, if we say, hey, you know, we'll grant a variance, will we grant that for variance for new construction? If we will, I'm totally comfortable. That's just the part that I wasn't sure.
Or add on to that last sentence, comma, or a semi-public or public water supply. Because that's the universe of everything, right?
Yeah.
That's all the options. So that's the other,
connection to a semi-public or public water supply.
Well, in case you miss any of them, I was just going to add, if you feel that there could be other water sources defined here, you may just want to put of use of water therein unless a suitable potable water supply is available. Just leave it at that.
But I guess somebody will then say, what makes it suitable? It's totally fine with me.
I don't like that.
And they might say, I'm going to get suitable water from my neighbor's private well.
Yeah, exactly. No, I think if we're going to amend it, I think we should amend that sentence and just comma, or a public water supply.
So
or
I've got,
semi-public.
what I scratched down was or connection to a semi-public or public water supply at the end of the sentence.
I like that.
Yes.
Ellen, does that pass the sniff test for you?
Yes, absolutely.
And so I'm going to put little circles next to the ones that we need to vote on other than en masse. So number 4 is one of the ones we need to vote on other than en masse. Is that right, Ellen?
Yes.
Okay. And then I don't see any public hands up. So I'm going to keep rolling to number 5. This is essentially mirroring the septic regulation. The differences here are that there's no kind of meter or clock for the timing of approval for a well permit from the state, so that section is not included. We are removing the plot plan parenthetical and putting in the number 2 here below. So we require a completed well construction permit application signed by the property owner with payment of the associated fee, a plan drawn to scale indicating the boundary lines of the applicant's property, the location and number of wells as required under 6 and 7, and the location of all existing and proposed structures and septic systems within 200 feet of each existing or proposed well on the applicant's property, and the existence of any existing or proposed driveway, right-of-way, or traveled way is defined in section 2.5, 2.6, and 2.7. Again, the jurisdictional areas of the Conservation Commission need to be reflected. We need to have written approval from Concom in the form of an administrative approval, negative determination of applicability, or an order of conditions. And if a new or replacement sewage disposal system is required, a complete disposal or construction permit application as described in Regulation 1. And it will be considered filed on the date upon which is filed with the Board of Health by the person who's seeking the permit. So again,
I
I
have a
think,
minor comment. If you go up to 1 and 2, all right. So it says that complete application shall include. There's an instance of a semicolon, I think, in 1 or 2 places. Some are periods, and then there's the word "and" after 3, but then there's 4 and 5. I would just maybe end them all with a period.
all right, so I just want to make sure that I'm getting, well, really, I want to make sure Ellen's getting down the specifics. Does that work for you, Ellen?
Yeah, that's fine. Just end all these with a period. Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, you're good?
And take out the word "and."
Yeah.
That's
Have that too.
All right. Ellen, you got what you need there?
Yes, I do.
And is 5 one we can vote on, or is that one I should be circling?
Since it has a change, you might as well circle it.
Okay, sounds good. Going down to section, to change number 6 in Regulation 2, we're amending this in a couple of ways with typically minor edits, but just to go over them. Again, we're moving potable from the description of water, including but not be limited to dug wells, driven or tubular wells, to make sure that the intent of this is not an exhaustive list. And then we remove the US EPA manual of individual water supply systems as it's no longer an active document, I think. Do I have that right?
yes.
In 2.2, again, there's minor kind of language additions, adding structures and adding in other apparatus. Again, in private water supply, we're removing human consumption or domestic use or purpose. And then one of the things we were working to do is to separate out lot, because again, that has been complicated, and to use property. So property, business, or residence is described in section 7 and shall be contained on the property, and should include all of the sources, treatment works, and distribution lines, and again, property. So we're essentially just changing the lot to property. The semi-public water supply we described here, and I think that there we go. Sorry, it took me a second. So this is saying any water system or intending to serve water for human consumption, human contact, or for domestic uses, or for purposes including but not limited to multiple dwellings, restaurant, food processing, prep and service. We removed dairies, we removed and before beaches and agriculture to incorporate things like, I think that would include dairies as well as other applications. I think this is one where I'd like to have a little bit more discussion. So semi-public water supplies serve more than one single family home on a single lot, but have service connections and or usage levels below the threshold for public water supply is defined and regulated by 310 CMR. It may include one or more wells associated with a project as defined in Sherborn Board of Health Regulation 3, Section 5. So for me, I think the biggest question I have is, I don't think that the intent of this is to regulate an ADU and all of the requirements, because I think as a town, it's been clear that there is an interest in having accessory dwelling units and have access for that. My concern is that if we don't exempt a single ADU, the regulation could be interpreted as, a house in an ADU is more than a house. And, does that trigger the requirements for semi-public water supply? I would favor adding an exclusion to exclude a single ADU. I don't think that you can have multiple ADUs. And if you did, I would be comfortable regulating them the same way we do a semi-public water supply, because again, it's a really weird structure in that context. But I wouldn't want to create an undue barrier for somebody to get or pursue an otherwise permittable ADU. But I don't like I feel moderately strongly, but I'm not sure I'm right. So I'd love other discussion.
So I agree with that. We really haven't yet added granularity to, if it's 2 homes, then what are the requirements? So right now, there's only one requirement for semi-public that goes beyond what we have for private wells at the moment. Or maybe 2, but they're loose and they're at the discretion of the board to some degree. So I could see having water supplies serve more than one single family home on a single lot, or one single family home plus one ADU on a single lot, and then the rest. So then that would exclude those 2 cases.
What was the first case, Daryl? I missed part of that.
Just the same. So the sentence that begins with semi-public water supplies serve more than one single family home on a single lot, or one single family home plus one ADU on a single lot.
Okay. What do other folks think?
I agree. That sounds fine.
I like it.
Ellen, do you have that?
I did not get that. Can you repeat that? Where?
So I think the sentence semi-public water supplies serve more than one single family home on a single lot, or a single family home and a single ADU on a single lot, but have service connections and or usage levels below the threshold for public water supplies.
Okay.
My only other question for this is in the section 2.3, we worked hard to take out lot and put property. Here we have lot. Do we want this to be lot or property?
Property.
Property.
Perfect. So Ellen, you know that amendment I just made? We're going to amend it and we're going to change the lots to properties. And then I want all hyphens, no commas. Sound good? I'm kidding about the hyphen part. I actually am totally team comma. Perfect. Okay, that sounds good to me. The driveway question in 2.5 had come up and was sort of in many ways be covered in the context in which this came up in the regulations will come up in other sections. I think in this, it's just saying if there's a common driveway that's being pursued by special permit, then that should go to the Board of Health when it goes to the planning board, so that these things are sort of clear and transparent and kind of obvious to all involved, so that we get notification that that's going and being discussed. And if there's any commentary that we have, it can be incorporated into that. Section 2.7, this was a question that Dr. Honeywell had raised, which was whether we should take out edge of the pavement. So we have replaced that with traveled surface on both sides on which vehicles normally travel. And so Ellen, I'm circling number 6 too.
Yes.
Any other discussion before I go to number 7? Perfect. All right, going to number 7. I think this really comes to a question of, from the board's standpoint, I think the public health interest, having manipulation, management, well behaviors being done by somebody who has training, background, skills that are sort of commensurate with the fact that this is a point of entry to a common water supply that serves that home, but may also serve homes around it. And so wanting to make sure that work that is done by professionals with an appropriate background. I think a question that Ellen had raised is, we've got language in section, in proposed change number 7 and proposed change number 17 that are both talking about the sanitary performance. And so I think one question is, I'm going to look at number 7 and then I'm going to jump to 17 with the question being, do we need to maintain this language in both sections? Do I have that right, Ellen?
Yes.
So here what we're saying, we're removing the gender identifier of his because we may have non-male well contractors, which is certainly possible and should be accommodated by the regulations, of well development work. And we add that the decontamination or disinfection of wells should be performed only by certified well drillers or other appropriate professionals and with approval from the Board of Health.
And on that last sentence, I'm going to agree with Ellen that it's duplicative, and we can probably just keep this definition simpler and keep the requirement elsewhere.
That is sort of my inclination. So let me jump to 17 and we'll see if we can so this is the sanitary protection, which is saying sanitary protection should be incorporated into the construction of the well. All newly completed wells shall be disinfected and or decontaminated in accordance with instruction from Mass DEP's current private well guidelines or suitably effective methods that are less toxic or less persistent. Disinfection, decontamination shall be carried out only by certified well drillers or other qualified professionals. Report of the disinfection procedure used shall be provided using the Board of Health's well disinfection and decontamination record form, which we will need to make exist prior to adopting the regulation. But from my standpoint, I felt like we could illuminate proposed change number 7, or illuminate that section of the regulations and incorporate it into 17.
I agree that we don't need that
Seems
duplicate
redundant.
statement up in
Yeah.
3.
Yeah, I do too.
All right, so
Also on the form, I think I noticed that Mass DEP or some other agencies might have had examples for forms that we could build upon.
perfect. All right, all right. So Ellen, for the purposes of number 7, now the proposed change would be to remove section 3.0 here.
No, just the last sentence.
Just the
Just the last sentence. Perfect. So in this case, we would just be making, we would take, we'd still make the replacement of his to well development, but we would remove the last sentence that starts with decontamination and or.
Mhm.
Perfect. Okay. All right, Ellen, I'm mostly circles over here. Number 8.
Yeah, I'm liking my idea less and less.
Perfect.
Unless we could just vote at the end as like to finalize as amended, but I guess we'll figure it out.
Ellen, does that sound plausible?
Yeah.
Okay, beautiful.
Okay.
Matt, you're laying the path for us. So section 8 is saying well drillers must be certified by the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and a copy of such certification shall be available on site for the agent's review. Any concerns with this?
Nope.
Perfect. All right, guys, we're at a third done. We're doing pretty good over here. We've got number 9, which is well location administrative changes to subsection 6.0 and E and F, changing G to H and adding new subsection G. So I think this is another one that I just wanted to talk about a little bit, which is, and Daryl, you alluded to this earlier, which is in our current regulation with the definition of the semi-public water supply that we discussed, the language that we have here is really the only set of requirements. And I think one comment, and I'll sort of look to either Daryl or Mark, was that there was a very specific scenario where the calculation in number one, at least as we'd submitted it to council, could allow for a shorter distance of setback for a semi-public water supply. I think it was like an upgradient, fast perking soil SAS. Am I remembering that right?
Except as I thought about this, because Mark did bring that up, but as I thought about it, this is different than saying what your separation is to a leaching field. This is just about
Here's a
the idea of,
yeah.
yeah, the idea of a protective area is set by Mass DEP for public water supplies, because since they're larger, they want the owners, operators of those kinds of wells to have more control over the land that might, upon which activities might take place that could have an impact on groundwater quality. So that's where this is somewhat derived from. So this is only talking about that. You still have to follow all the rules for setback to leaching fields and other
Okay. And so this is
roadways and everything else still applies. This is just whether you have control over that land.
Okay.
I did I pulled up my spreadsheet with the numbers to refresh myself. And for a system to hit the 125 feet, according to that 150 times log of the pit pumping rate in gallons per day minus 350, it would take almost 1,500 gallons per day of a supply to reach the 125 feet.
Okay.
That does beg the question, if it's two homes, say at 700, two small homes, 700 gallons a day would only be 75, 76 or so feet.
But I would also say, like, again, I think, for me, I think there's, at least my take on it is, there's kind of a balance of, we want to have a protective area and to be thoughtful about that, but you also want to allow flexibility in those instances where it aligns with other town values. So for me,
you may want to add a minimum protective radius is to be whatever you wish it to be. I'd say 200 feet. It's a little bit more than what we require for very permeable soils with a 2-minute per inch rate. So you may want to put a minimum radius within this.
But I think part of, Daryl, I think what I'm hearing from you is, this is really saying this is more a radius of control, and it doesn't take away from any of those other setback requirements. It's really saying you need to have a radius that's this big. If we think about my private well, that's like probably a 20-foot radius, right? Because that's like the proper, am I remembering the property line setback right?
That's 25, but
yeah,
the radius.
Yeah, so this is a lot more
right
than that.
And so I think, to your point, Daryl, we're not taking away from the setbacks that I think, Mark, you're describing. It's really saying, if Matt Vitale's well, we say, what's that radius? It's 25 feet. If my neighbor and I had a semi-public water supply, they could each be 25 feet. This is saying, hey, it needs to be 75 feet. And as you get bigger, that area of control gets bigger. And so I think that Daryl, what you're saying sounds right to me, which is, this doesn't take away from any of the setback requirements or other considerations. This is really just saying you need to have agency over this because you're doing something that is truly not a single home, and that there's some level of further support that is prudent.
Should it state that, though? Because this could confuse a developer thinking that protective radius may cover septic systems.
We could refer to it as something like area under owner's control or something. I don't know. Yeah. It's usually called a protective area, and this is
I-
how it works for public water supplies, is it's
Yes.
just ends up on someone's property, but
I, what if we added a second sentence to number one that said, any such protective radius does not replace setback requirements?
yeah.
Matt, you're always better at making me talking too much shorter and better. What are your thoughts?
No, I think that's fine. I think it's clear as it is, but I think if we want to be double clear, I think it's fine to put a sentence in there that says this, what do we say right now? Whichever is larger. I mean, you can even just say, and not less than any required setback.
Well, except the setback could still apply to the neighbor's leaching field, right? So then,
So what if we
I
just
don't know,
say,
I
and-
see them as distinct, not as
What
in
it-
either or.
So can there be a leach field within the 125-foot radius?
No.
No, there could not be, right?
Yeah,
But
so I
it could
think
be
so-
on
so
someone
then I-
else's property.
No,
This-
but isn't this additional? So this is, you already had the other ones. This is saying in addition to all of these two, correct?
Oh, yeah,
Yes,
that's
yes.
right. Meet the following additional requirements.
Yeah, so
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
so those are all taken care of.
Yep. That,
Yeah,
I think
it's fine.
that works for me.
Okay.
I guess my other question, again, as we think about the open space subdivisions or other structures like that, I was trying to think of, do I see a scenario where we're making that requirement that you're like, oh, like, let's say I've got 4 houses or 5 houses. Do we get to places where the setback requirements are more burdensome for a semi-public water supply than they are for a public water supply? Like if we sort of do that calculus, do we get a protective area that's larger than it would be for Pine Hill School or something unintended? Because I feel like the open space subdivisions or some of those clustering strategies are places that we certainly want to be mindful of, but it doesn't make sense to me to say we have 5 houses and then that now got us to a place where it's more than 500 students.
So as I said, let's see, if we looked at 1,000 gallon a day water supply would be 100-foot radius. And that could be to how many bedrooms? You could have 2 property, 2 homes, a 4 and a 5 bedroom.
And so as we get to something
roughly,
that's like,
so.
so for me, if we get to, I guess, if we look at would it be like, what's analogous, Daryl? Is it the zone 1 protection for a public water supply? Is that sort of
Yeah.
analogous to the,
Yeah.
so like, what would, like, if we get to a place with 3 or 4, like, what's our threshold for public water supply? In my head, it was 10,000 gallons per day, but maybe I'm off.
No, the threshold is more governed by number of people served or
served.
number of service
Oh, okay.
connections.
Isn't it
Yeah.
more than 25 or is that, I can't remember, Daryl.
Yeah, it's 25 or more people a day for
Yeah.
at least 60 days a year.
Yeah.
And so-
And
And then so-
15
Right.
connections, whatever they are. So I'm saying that if we wanted to make this a little easier, because in a way, I don't want to drive even 2 homes that there's some economy of scale if they're going to share a well, because it's whatever the project's property is. They could save some money, do more testing, more frequent testing with the amount of money that they have. Whether 100 feet would be a better radius, perhaps, as the minimum, to be owned and to be entirely on the project's property.
And so I think I don't want to get us stuck here. What I would say is I'd like to circle back to this one just so people have kind of a chance to chew it on it in their head a little bit, and we can circle back. I don't know what the right answer is. I just want to make sure we make a conscious choice on it before the public hearing, because I think this is the one, to me, this feels like the section that is most like our cesspool discussion last time, where the public hearing was really helpful, but I just want to make sure like the unintended consequences are clear. All right, so I'm putting a star, Ellen, next to number 9 to come back to.
Got it.
And we've got number 10, which is multiple lots associated with one owner and association are added to business or residence, to just add that language. Any further comments for number 10? That's where I landed too. Number 11, we're updating the name of the installation manual for pump houses because that was outdated. And so we've removed the old language and added manual of individual and non-public water supply systems. Pitless adapters or pitless units shall be installed in accordance with the current version of the National Sanitation Foundation standard for pitless water adapters. Any further comment on number 11?
I mean, that is the current standard I could find, but like what we've had to eliminate before.
It'll change with
It always
time.
makes me nervous to have one thing to reference, but that's the way it goes, I guess.
Perfect. We won't put this one on the stone tablet. This one we'll know we have to come back to in some future version of ourselves. Number 12, we are adding section 11.3, adding 11.4, and we're illuminating the statement in terms of the well yield requirement that a bedroom shall include any undeveloped area that could be made into a bedroom, as we felt that that was inappropriately broad, is my recollection of our discussion. So we're taking that section out. We are adding that a well shall be installed and developed in accordance with Sherborn specific. And I think I would propose that we change requirements to regulations for this one.
Yes.
And Mass
Agree with
DEP's
that.
current private well guidelines. And then we added the section on the static water level, so that if the static water level in a well in the well drilling log is more shallow than the depth to bedrock for the well boring, once the development is completed, the driller will provide reasoning behind why that level was observed to ensure that we don't believe that this is inappropriately drawing from the overburdened groundwater, which could result in contamination. Any discussion of either of those changes? Perfect. We're up to number 13. These are the well performance tests. We're adding the word well performance in front of tests. And then well flushing shall be performed only as necessary and only by certified well drillers or other well management professionals. For those instances where flushing is more extensive flushing is required, then the board requires approval, and the Board of Health may impose additional requirements for flushing that exceed 12 hours in total in terms of tailoring to the patterns of use and behavior there. Because again, I would say this would kind of be an outlier pattern in terms of how much flushing is typically required in those instances when flushing of a well is required. So it's really to put some guardrails up to say at some point, this probably warrants more conversation, and in the opinion of the board, it in fact does. And so
And
12
Mark,
hours.
can you just remind us how much flushing you typically see in town for well development?
Well, actually, it depends on what they're trying to do. Sometimes a well will be drilled and is a very good water producing well, and it creates a sump below the pump. So I have seen wells like that being flushed for many days, to be honest with you. So it depends on the physical characteristics of the well.
Okay, can you say what the majority time
The-
period is?
the
I remember you
majority-
saying in the
yeah.
past that it was,
Typically, a well is not flushed more than a day, but there are wells that they are trying to get contaminants out of the sump below the pump where the pump is set. And sometimes that might take several flushings. We had one at the corner of Mill and Nason Hill Road years ago that I think they flushed that for possibly 10 days because of that issue.
mhm. Okay, I just had in mind that you had mentioned maybe in the 4 to 8 hour range was the, what would one call it, the mode, kind of the most frequent,
I would say
taking away
that's-
these outliers, but maybe I'm remembering that incorrectly.
Oh, I
just
would
wanted to
say
make sure.
that's probably correct. That's the average, but sometimes
Okay.
a stubborn well that the contaminants just will not flush out as easily as a different type of well that's not as a great producer that So that way the pump is actually pumping out the sump at the same time, the area below the pump. But it's case by case. In most cases, I would say 12 hours is sufficient. And if it needs to go back to the Board of Health, I don't think that's a problem.
Yeah, this was more to make sure that there's not something peculiar, or whether we could weigh in and help or seek help from the state. Or if it's during a drought period.
Yeah, because this is like,
might that have? So,
because this is like, again, if we think about a lot of our wells in that kind of 4 or 5 gallons per minute, am I remembering that right, Mark? Like you're talking about saying if you're pumping 3,000 to 4,000 gallons out because it's contaminated, like we should be involved in that conversation. And I think particularly in this environment of water scarcity,
Sure.
even if we're wet right now, that threshold makes sense to me. I think this is one we might need to revisit if we're like, gosh, it turns out a lot of people are doing a lot more, but especially with all the droughts, like it just feels prudent to think this through together collaboratively.
Sure.
yeah, and it just says may impose, may or may
Yep.
not.
Kind of tailored to the circumstance.
Yep.
Any further discussion of number 13? Perfect. Okay. That brings us up to 14, which is a well abandonment. This is the adding well abandonment, decommissioning, or repair. Again, that this should be abandoned by a properly decommissioned by a certified well driller. Again, there's no changes to those requirements. We've also said that homeowner repair for a well is imprudent. And so only certified well drillers are authorized to alter or repair a well. And for wells that have undergone repair, a sample shall be tested for total coliform bacteria and any other parameters deemed appropriate by the Board of Health prior to be returned to use. So this is sort of analogous to what would be required for a new well, at least as it comes to the fecal contamination portion of it. Any
And
further?
what's meant by parameters deemed appropriate is, say they've used some new kind of disinfectant or whatever during the repair. So maybe we'd want to have a test for that just to make sure that there's no residual. So, again, another case by case determination.
Perfect. Next is number 15, which is amending language in subsection A. Again, this is updating outdated language to the, again, what will someday be outdated language, but at least we're current for now, of current version NSF/ANSI 61-2021 drinking water system components - health effects. Any further discussion of that? Perfect. We've got number 16, regulation 2. We're just removing end quantity specifications from it. Number 17, we talked about, we feel good about it. We need to complete this form or create this form. Any further discussion on 17? Perfect. For number 18, we've got a minimum of 2 samples shall be collected by a qualified professional and submitted to a state-approved laboratory for analysis. And so I think that we'd had some discussion here about, homeowner collection versus third-party collection. I'm trying to remember who had. I remember we had discussion about this, and it was the feeling that having it properly collected was important, and that if one didn't follow the testing protocols, it could result in inaccurate results. Am I remembering that discussion correctly?
Yeah,
Well,
I mean,
yes.
since we're now adding PFAS to it, yes, I think
Okay.
that makes sense, because there's can be things that can be confounders.
And it's important to have a good chain of custody. I've always had trouble with the fact that we don't have a chain of custody with qualified professionals. So it's needed in my view, and it actually can save money for the applicant, because if the applicant themselves are trying to do the actual testing, they sometimes can make mistakes, as I've just seen recently.
Yeah, and this isn't like, oh, I'm moving to a house with a well, I want to just collect a sample and see how it is. This is to get a potable well online, you know.
This is sort of right. You're like, this will happen once for a while.
Yeah,
unless it's
yeah.
repaired.
This is very, very important.
Yeah,
Perfect.
it's for the permitted well.
Exactly, so.
Perfect. Any further discussion?
Yeah.
Perfect. And then Lisa, is 19 the one where I need to go to your red
Yes.
line version? Okay. Let me pull up the, let me pull up the red line version. Does that sound
Okay.
right?
Yeah.
Perfect. And then Lisa, I'm going to display the comments. Is that okay?
Yeah.
Perfect. And so Ellen, I think Lisa, you sent this to both Ellen and I. Am I remembering that right?
Yep, I sent it as an attachment. It's in
Perfect.
Word,
Perfect.
and it's
And
red. Yeah.
perfect. And so I think that for the purposes of tonight, I think Lisa's red line version is sort of what we'll talk about and sort of make edits to rather than the PDF. Does that work okay for you, Ellen?
Yeah, that's perfect.
Perfect.
Do you have it, Matt? Can you?
Oh
pull-
yeah, I
okay.
think I'm sharing it. Do you guys see it?
Not yet. This is the old one.
Is this right?
No.
N- No. it's
Nothing's-
Are you guys still seeing the PDF?
Yeah.
yes, we are.
Perfect. That is on me. Like 3 years in,
I
I'm
got
getting really
nervous. I was
comfortable.
like, oh no, did it? I mean, I have it on my there.
No, 100%. It's like
Okay.
I'm looking over my glasses here. Now we're on track.
Yeah.
And so, Lisa, do you want to kind of just walk us through what you put in and
Yeah,
sort of your
and
recommendations?
there definitely something happened with like some of the formatting, Ellen. So we're not
Yeah.
going to worry about that. Like sometimes words were merged together.
Right.
Yeah. So I'll
that's
stick to
no
the
problem.
substantive, right?
Yeah.
So I did look into the methods and I looked at detection limits. So I have updated section C accordingly to specify the current method, but for VOCs, that's 524.2, I put and updates because that way as they update it, we don't need to keep changing our regs. And then for PFAS, there's 2 EPA methods that are currently approved for drinking water analysis. So those are both referenced there, 533 and 537.1 and updates. Okay, and so that's saying here are the methods that you need to have these constituents analyzed using by the certified lab. So that's good. And then it says here are all the things you need to analyze for, all the stuff that we've always required. The only new things that I think we're adding are the PFAS, because VOCs were already in there, right, Daryl?
Mhm.
Yes.
Yeah. So only PFAS has been added just because there are now federal standards and they're considered, constituents of concern for people. So I sort of just modified slightly. I made it all caps for method detection limit for VOCs. And then as we discussed for PFAS, I'm simply linking it to the Massachusetts standards, which, as we discussed at the beginning of this meeting, have to be at least as stringent as the federal standards. So this way, we're not going to have to keep changing our regs every time the state or EPA changes it. We're just going to reference the state regulations because we all think that the water quality should be at least as sort of clean and of the same quality that's required for public water supplies. That should be the minimum standard. And so I think it makes sense to link it to that. And we're using things that are, promulgated by the federal and state government. So it's not something we're making up. We're not making up these standards. We're relying on the standards that are made by the federal government and the state. So I think those are all along the lines of what we've been discussing. And then So I wasn't sure what's section 17.0.
I think that's us.
Okay, so we should make that clear here, like section 17 of these
Sure.
of the Sherborn Board of Health regulations, or like we should provide the
Or like
citation
section 17 above.
17.
Or I can put Sherborn, regulation 2, water supply, Sherborn regulation 2, water supply.
Yeah, I would be very specific because right now it's not, and I was like, what is this referring to? So
don't we refer elsewhere to
Yeah.
say, see section 7, and we haven't put everything in? I'm just questioning whether we
well, so
need to
then
do
all
that.
requirements of section 17, provided above in these regulations or something. I was like, where is this coming from? Is this section 17?
Yeah, it is.
So okay, of how about then, like, of this section? Like, I don't know, to me it just seemed kind of weird of this section to be self-referencing the section that you're in.
Yes.
I don't know, that just seemed confusing to me. So
Yeah.
It's because it's saying it's
It's a
separate,
semi-public water
just
versus
to remind people that the well regs cover everything,
all requirements of section 17.
whether
So I think
irrigation well.
How about as provided herein or some, I don't know, just to me,
Yeah.
it seemed vague.
I mean, I think for F, what it's saying is, we told you a bunch of stuff for all walls. Semi-public has to meet that. I think that's your,
Yeah.
so I think that I kind of like your all requirements identified herein,
Yeah,
because that's like reinforcing it. And
Okay.
also doesn't tie it to section 17 if someday it's section 17.2.
exactly. Yeah.
And we may add stuff depending on the characteristics of that water supply to tailor it to the project at hand.
Okay.
And
Yeah.
could be, we need to do more sampling or lab testing or whatever.
Yeah.
Yeah. Ellen, did you get that?
No,
So I think
I got
we're
it,
saying,
section 17 as identified herein.
I would say all requirements identified herein, remove of section 17, and then no other changes to that subsection F.
Oh, remove, okay. I did not.
Because
say-
herein would apply to anything we're saying in this document.
Yeah, okay.
Should we say all well water quality requirements
Herein?
identified herein to
Yeah.
make
Yeah.
it-
We probably want to be specific about that.
But don't we have that above where it says water quality?
Yeah, it says water
semi-public
quality of semi-public water supplies. I think it's clear enough.
Except if we're just saying herein, you don't know that it's all of section 17. It could be
How about
all of reg 2. It could,
yeah.
whatever.
How about
So-
all requirements of section 17 herein? I don't know.
Didn't want 17 because then it ties it to 17.
Yeah, because it's sort of into
But
itself.
must comply with all regulations of the town of Sherborn, the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and the US EPA.
But Daryl's saying make it clear that it's about wells, although it does say water quality. So I mean,
Yeah,
Yeah.
it says water
Water
quality.
quality. Okay.
I think that covers it. Yeah, I think.
So it would be. Matt,
No,
can you
I
say-
don't think you want to reference anything but
I said
regs, 'cause
water quality is similar.
we already reference all that. So we already have all that. So I think saying, of all requirements as specified in these Board of Health regulations, or I don't know, like if you want to not make it just this section,
Hmm.
all requirements
In
applicable.
of regulation 2 of
Yeah,
Sherborn.
perfect. All
Yeah, that's fine.
requirements of
I like that
Sherborn
better. Right. so-
Regulation 2.
right.
Perfect.
Because Daryl, that way,
Yeah.
of course, it only applies to the water quality issues for a well. It's not going to
Yeah.
apply to other things. So I think that's fine, Ellen. I like
Okay.
So where is that going? Is that getting rid
So
of?
I think
as
instead of
identified?
all requirements, instead of section 2,
Okay,
of section
of
17 will
section
be
six.
of regulation 2.
Yeah, right. And the blue stuff is the stuff that's coming out. Right?
The blue stuff, the blue italics is coming out. Yep.
Yes.
Yes.
So I think that's fine.
Okay.
Because
So
I
I think-
already specified.
Yeah, we specified that above. Sorry.
Well, actually, so I have a question. Do we want to, do our semi-public water supplies, do we want to make them mimic public water supplies, which has to sample for other things besides the things we
I
specify?
think we want to tailor to it because I might say one thing for 2 houses and I might say something else for 4 houses. Like, I think we give ourselves flexibility in tailoring it to the specifics of the project.
Okay,
And
so we say, so those are the minimum requirements.
yeah,
Okay,
that's how I'm reading it.
okay.
Right,
Um,
and I think it's just such a difficult area to predict
Where it's gonna go.
what would be appropriate, because it's a
Yeah.
big leap up to public water supply level regs.
Right, right.
It's a tricky area that we're covering. 2 homes versus 14 homes or whatever. So
And then the last thing, it just said, the way it's worded down makes it sound like if any concentration is detected, it doesn't, like, we say they can take 2 samples. Right? Because sometimes you can, we want to confirm, and sometimes you might have like some kind of laboratory contaminant, or, just, I don't know. I felt
so
uneasy.
what
It
if-
would require 3 samples, though.
Yeah, so it just
so
says,
what if we replace detected with established to be?
or is.
Mm.
Mark, do you
Yeah,
have
let
any?
Mark help. Uncle.
Yeah, thanks. I was trying to stay out of this conversation. But I mean,
How about if results of the sampling described in section blah, which talks about multiple sampling,
Yeah,
indicate something like that. So that way
I agree.
it's not, I just don't like the word any, because maybe it was like right at the detection limit in one of them, but the other 2, it was non-detect, and we're comfortable.
Yeah, and we've gone through so many different scenarios in this situation, and they're all case by case. So
Yeah.
I know I involved Matt just recently in one as well. They're all case by case, but keep it as generic as possible is what I would say.
So
What about if concentrations of VOCs or PFAS are confirmed?
yeah, but what's that mean? Then you're
Well,
using
our
the word-
confirming is those multiple.
Can you
Okay,
go
like
up to the place it talks about the multiple samples? Where is that?
Two
Uh,
I
consecutives.
don't think it talks about them, doesn't it?
It does it's not this section. It's a
We
different
give
section.
guidance if they hit a VOC. We give guidance on that somewhere in these.
I thought that I think it's someplace else. It's not here. This is just saying what you need to sample for, but I thought if you keep
That's
going
correct,
up,
Lisa.
keep going up. So, it's not,
it's
not
not
in
in
this
this one.
section.
I think it's in
it's
the
not in
next
this
section.
section. I think it was in the prior section.
Yeah.
um
Like if the results of
you're thinking of
sampling-
you were thinking of 17.2, which reads a minimum of 2 water samples shall be collected by a qualified professional and submitted to a state approved laboratory for analysis consistent with the requirements of the Board of Health.
Yeah.
And that's 1 from the wellhead and 1 from the tap.
And so it sounds like what we want to provide here is flexible language to reflect the fact that each circumstance may be different. There could be times that it's 2 tests, there could be times that it's 3 tests.
How about if results of the sampling described in section blah above indicate confirmed above? How about that? Like, so that way it's not tying it to like just the concentration. It's saying like the results of the sampling.
So just change, so if any
Described.
concentration of volatile organic compounds or PFAS
Yeah, just say,
what if we just replace detected and confirmed?
but it
I
says, if
vote for
any,
that.
I don't like if it says if any concentration. So you're,
Right.
I'm
Take out
saying if
any.
the
Oh,
results
gotcha.
testing
If
described in
Gotcha.
section above indicate VOCs or PFAS, or confirm levels of PFAS above blah blah blah, something like
Okay.
that.
Can I try this just so Ellen has a shot of like transcribing? So if concentration of volatile organic compounds or PFAS is confirmed above levels presented in D above, right? Because you're talking at this section, right,
Yep,
Lisa?
yep.
Where the sodium concentration is greater than 28, a document.
So
we
get
take-
rid of
we-
any and get rid of
and change
detected and
detected
replace
to
it with
confirmed.
Okay, I think that works.
Any concerns from the board? And Ellen, is that clear for you?
Yes,
Perfect. All right. So I think that
How
this,
about, oh, what, so you want to say like concentration, so with like the S in parentheses of VOCs
okay.
or PFAS?
So we're removing any. So
Yeah.
if taking out any, we're adding a parenthetical S after concentration.
Yep.
And we're changing detected to confirmed.
Yep.
Sound good?
Yeah.
Perfect.
and is stay remaining above the level, above levels.
Yeah,
presented
yeah,
in D
yeah,
above.
Yeah.
it's confirmed. Yeah.
And
Yeah,
I
yeah.
put presented in subsection D above.
Yep. Subsection D. However you would describe the section that I'm currently highlighting on the screen.
Okay,
Sound good?
yeah,
Yep.
All right. Does everybody feel comfortable with that?
Yeah.
Perfect. All right. I think that brings us to the 2/3 mark. So let me stop sharing this and go back to the PDF. And Lisa, thanks for your work on that. It's much appreciated.
Sure.
All right. So now we're going to number 20, which is saying treatment units shall be installed with the capability of bypassing such units during a repair event or other special action, or if the raw water no longer requires treatment. So just providing more specificity than necessary or required, because that was felt to be insufficiently specific. I think 21 is one where I'm not sure we need to add it. I think that this is language that came from model regulations from MHB, if I'm remembering correctly, but I'm not.
Yes, it was model regulations from Mass DEP. But as Ellen pointed out, which I thought was great, is that this is more about board procedures than about regulations that property owners need to follow. So we could have this more as a policy for us or a procedure for us.
Perfect. So then, Ellen, how would that translate? Would we leave 18B1 as it stood originally, or we would delete that whole section?
that's up to you. You could keep the new section up until that any order the board issues. You don't need that,
Okay.
but it's
I
up to
would-
the board which way you'd want to go.
I would be comfortable with that, to use the model well regulation language, but then leave out the details of the process that we would follow. I agree with that.
So it would be the text that I have highlighted on the screen now that starts with the Board of Health and ends with of this regulation. Would be the language.
I would say if any investigation reveals a violation, then that's good for people to know.
Yeah,
I
I
think.
think, yeah, I think just delete the any order the board issues and the bullet points below
Okay.
that part, right?
So this highlighted section, any order extending through subsection D, I guess B1D. Sound good?
I should have sent you a Word document, not a PDF.
I know. Think how much happier you'd be. But
I
now
know. Yeah.
you like a challenge. All right. So, but Ellen, you sort of have that section of we're going to strike this portion.
Yeah.
And then South Middlesex Registry of Deeds, because all of the deeds in Sherborn are in
Right.
South Middlesex. I think this is one where we have the Regulation 3, Public and Environmental Health Review Regulation and standards for other than a single family dwelling or lot. We're amending the title to be for selected site development activities or other special conditions, or for other than a single family dwelling on a single lot. So we're updating the name of the regulation. And then we are providing kind of formatting changes. So any of the following activities requires the submittal of a complete EHIR to the Board of Health. an application to construct 10 or more dwelling units served by an existing or proposed private way or by a common driveway, right of way, or traveled way, which is replacing the italicized language, an application for approval of a subdivision plan, an application for approval of an open space residential subdivision under the Town of Sherborn zoning bylaws, section 4.5, an application to construct a building with a gross floor area exceeding 75 square feet. Excuse me, an application to
commercial.
construct a commercial or industrial building with a gross floor area exceeding 7,500 square feet. An application for all or part of a project with design sewage flow of 2,000 gallons per day or greater. An application for approval of a planned unit development special permit is set forth in the Town of Sherborn zoning bylaws, section 4.6. An application for comprehensive permit under MGL 40B and or any plan that involves removal of sod, loam, clay, sand, gravel, stone, whether quarried or not, or other natural materials from the premises of a property or a project exceeding a volume of 350 cubic yards in total. And Mark, I remember when we discussed this previously, you translated that to number of dump trucks, and it was many dump trucks.
That is correct. I think we're up in the 30s or so.
Yeah. And then the EHIR report shall not be accepted for review by the Board of Health unless such report meets the criteria required by this and all other applicable Board of Health regulations that provide specific information relative to the operation of the proposed sewage treatment and disposal systems, including soil conditions, surface drainage calculations, hydrogeologic descriptions of groundwater resources and movements, effects of precipitation, wastewater treatment methodology. None of the activities listed in this section may commence until the Board of Health has completed its review of the EHIR, and if so required by this section. Should this be "and" instead of "and"?
No, and.
Like
and-
A-N, not A-N-D.
Yes,
An environmental health permit has been issued. Any further discussions? And no changes are proposed to the final two paragraphs of the existing subsection. I think we sort of talked and discussed this at some length in previous meetings. This all sort of looks right to me, and I think tries to balance. The intent is to tailor regulation to the circumstance, and I think being clear that there's a category of project that's materially different than a typical single-family home, and as such represents and warrants its own piece of further scrutiny. Going to number 24, which is just removing capitalization to change it to environmental health permit, because we don't want people to feel like we're yelling. Going to number 25, this is regulation 3, adding a subsection number to existing definitions and adding a new definition, which is the definition of the term project, which is defined herein, which is in determining whether a project is subject to EHIR, semi-public water supply categorization, and or requirements of regulation 3, the Board of Health shall consider the entirety of the project, including but not limited to any likely future expansion and not separate segments thereof. The following criteria are considered when determining whether the various work or activities constitute one project, including but not limited to whether the work or activities taken together comprise a common plan, regardless of whether there's more than one proponent or lot, any time interval between the work and or activities, and whether the environmental health impacts caused by the work or activities are separable or cumulative. Phasing or other forms of project segmentation shall not evade, defer, or curtail application of Board of Health regulations pertaining to larger projects. I think that all sounded good to me. Any kind of further discussion by the board or any concerns?
Just that this is a new section of the regulations, not just a change or modification.
Yep.
So we always have to remember this has to be advertised, the public hearing obviously advertised and sent to DEP once approved, so it's official.
Okay, thanks, Mark.
I
And-
don't know if DEP is going to require, this isn't really a subject that requires scientific information, but again, we do have to make sure it follows all the procedures required to implement a new regulation.
So I'll note that this wording largely came from NEPA, which is at the state level. Environmental Policy Act. And what's included in MEPA was way too complicated for what we do here. It's for much larger projects. And if it got to that level, the large projects would be covered by MEPA. So this was in a court case where they were defining what it meant to try to evade, defer, or curtail application of regulations at the MEPA level. So it was borrowed from them.
I personally think that that's enough support. Professionally feel the same way too. I think you got enough support with what you just said, Daryl. I just was bringing that up just for process.
Yeah. Oh, no. And, welcome the DEP's review of anything that we have here.
Perfect. Any further discussion on 5.3? All right. So adding, going to number 26, we're removing the word domestic from the first sentence and adding a second paragraph. So we're moving the domestic here. For semi-public water supplies, sufficient provision shall exist to ensure future ownership and/or control over the protective area for each well as established per Regulation 2, Section 6G, and associated land use therein shall be limited to those directly related to the provision of water, or shall have no significant adverse impact on the availability or quality of water for drinking, human contact, cleaning, water using infrastructure, agriculture, and other uses. The board may require additional protective measures that are determined to be suitable, customary, appropriate, or reasonable in serving or maintaining the interests of water quantity or quality. Looks good to me. Any other comment?
That's borrowed from, to some extent, from public water supplies, protective areas.
Perfect.
Language, not as extensive as what they have, though.
So tailored, adapted,
Mhm.
tailored.
Yep.
Perfect. And then Regulation 3, amending the second subsection of this for the sewage disposal. The applicant shall submit evidence that in Section 1, the proposed location is there. We are changing dwelling lots to units in subsection 2, and we're adjusting the minimum wastewater flow to 2,000 gallons per day from 4,400. Just for folks who are on the call who don't see this, again, Mark, correct me if I'm wrong, but the design flow is 110 gallons per day. So this
That's
is
correct.
essentially, clearing, 18 or 19 bedrooms to trigger this. And so certainly multiple household units, and I think warranting a tailored approach.
And there are additional regulations for septic systems that are 2,000 gallons per day or over.
Perfect.
And when we amended the threshold in a section above for EHIR triggering, or to make it more clear when an EHR would be required, we used the 2,000 gallons a day. And I think we just forgot to change it in this section. So that's partly what this is about. And as Mark pointed out, Mass DEP has additional requirements for anything over 2,000 gallons a day. So this was recommended at the time that we were updating the threshold for EHIR requirements. It was recommended by someone at DEP to use this threshold.
Perfect. All right. Any further discussion on that one? For change number 28, we're removing the words project 4 from the first sentence. So these regulations shall apply to any and all industrial commercial projects or for any other projects except for the construction of single family and 2-family dwellings. Any further discussion there? Going to number 29, we added the phrase as part of a project to subsection A. I think one question that Dr. Honeywell had raised at a previous meeting was whether there should be a 0 cubic yard threshold for bedrock disruption. I think the feedback from the board was that there's some balance of risk and benefit, and that a 0 level threshold was likely to be an undue burden to individual property owners and difficult to enforce. And the 10 cubic yard threshold in our opinion, remained reasonable. I think in kind of the general discussion of the regulations, it does appear that the use of thresholds, whether that is maintaining our existing well setback thresholds or using a minimum disruption level threshold, remains appropriate and sort of should be tailored by the board to the circumstances, which I think this one has.
And also that the moving off of a 0 threshold was influenced by the last public hearing when we were discussing the addition of that section altogether. So,
Yep. And again, I think for all of these things, there's a piece where it may be that more aggressive regulation kind of nominally reduces risk, but I think we have to kind of look for where the bang for the buck is. And I think having a threshold makes it much more enforceable and sort of much more tailored to the level of risk involved. And I don't think
And
there's
frankly,
anything.
more likely to be complied with.
Yep.
It has to consider practicality.
Absolutely.
Implementation. So,
Yep.
it's just like if your parents say, "Don't ever do this." It's like, guess what?
I'm getting a motorcycle.
Note to self.
No, I think a great point, Lisa. And I think it really is trying to find that balance. And I don't think there's any threshold we could use that we could say we've now proven that there's no risk. I think it's balancing those thoughtfully, which I think we've tried to do. For change number 30, we are, what are we doing here on? We are taking out per lot or 1,000 cubic yards out of the regulation. Is that, Alan, am I missing something here? I feel like are we missing something in the description of what we're doing in number 30?
Yeah, I just noticed that I didn't put a description there.
Oh, I'm glad it's you, not me. That works good. Or that works well. So in terms of what we're changing, we're just removing per lot 1,000 cubic yards.
Yeah.
And no changes to what those requirements were.
Right.
Any further discussion of that other than me giving Ellen a hard time? All right, hearing none. And change 31 is just a minor grammatical correction to turn wherever into one word. I think that's going to be the spiciest part of the whole discussion. And then let me look back and just see where I'd put the star. What was that? Was that number 10? Or number 9?
Yeah, I think so.
See, it's perfect. We've done this long enough that I don't remember what the question was, so we're in great shape.
yes, Matt Beavers.
I don't remember either.
I think it was section.
Oh yeah, it was the radius calculation.
Right, and so I think one question, Daryl, was, do we have any scenario where a public water supply would have a smaller radius than our semi-public water supply in terms of its zone 1 protection area?
Well, let me pull up my little spreadsheet again here. As I said, I think the smallest for a public water supply is 100 feet. So we could do that. And as I mentioned, that's 1,000 gallons, which is roughly 9 bedrooms.
Yeah.
So that's, I think that would be okay.
So
at first I was using the 125 feet, but again, our 125 feet as the minimum is applying to different setbacks.
Yeah. So it
which
sounds
can
like
still be preserved. It doesn't compromise it by reducing that number. So maybe 100 is more appropriate.
As a floor, I think that's reasonable. I guess the other question is, if 100 is the floor, so by whichever the following is larger, for a public water supply, is the zone of protection commensurate with the total gallons, or is it a fixed, it's 100-foot radius?
They do it different ways, but that protective radius that you see there is an equation that's used by Mass DEP. I did not come up with that.
Okay, and so we're essentially saying we are, like, we could use 100 feet here or this protective radius, which is sort of the way that Mass DEP is tailoring it to a public water supply, saying, hey, your zone of control needs to be similar. I guess I favor reducing it from 125 feet as the floor, if that's what kind of the smallest public water supply could be. It seems reasonable to say semi-public doesn't need to be more restrictive than that. I can see a logic for it, which would be that a public water supply has many more testing requirements. And so I think that would be the argument for a larger protective radius for a semi-public. I want to balance that with unintended consequences of how this could affect cluster developments or open space subdivisions or other things to try to balance that. So that's kind of why I like going from the 125 to 100, but the others feel differently.
No,
that's
I'd
reasonable.
feel better about 100 as well.
Okay. And so we'll change 125 to 100. I think that sounds good. Anything else that people want to go back to, or any public comments or questions on any of these that we've gone over that are sort of tickling your fancy, or you feel like you've got something you want to add?
So Brian Moore has his hand up.
Perfect. Brian, fire away.
Thank you. Can you hear me okay? Good.
Yep.
So first of all, with the 125-foot radius in the one that we were just reviewing now, I really feel like, you know, the whole purpose of having a protections for semi-private or semi-public, whichever it is to make sure that the water supply quality is available and quantity is available for multiple dwelling locations. And I think setting our standards at the basement of the public water supply standards is not an unreasonable or onerous approach to take in this case, having nor is having a protective radius that has to be protected for those very purposes. So I'm not sure I'm in agreement with reducing that to 100. I think if you have a concern about it becoming too onerous as a section for for this situation, you could add another caveat at the end of it, which would maybe serve to say in no instance would it go beyond that which would be required for XYZ, and that would serve the same that would satisfy the same concerns that I heard voiced tonight during your meeting. But of course, this is for you guys to decide, not for me to decide. So I'll leave those comments where they lie. And then sections 9 and 10, there seemed to be a little bit of a conflict. I'm sorry, not sections 9. Your blue writing, is that, yeah.
That's a change number.
Yeah, okay, so change number 9 and 10 seem to be slightly in conflict, because in 10, you have, let me see what if I can read my own notes here. You have properties listed in change number 10 under 7, that you're treating a single property for the purposes of this requirement. Yet in the previous protective measures talk about the protective radius being on the property of the well. I just want to make sure that there's not, that those mesh, perfectly, 9 and 10, so that someone doesn't exploit one at the detriment to the other.
So I think for 10, it's a sort of less permissive standard. So it's saying if Matt Vitale owns 3 lots and owns all 3 of them, Matt Vitale gets 1 well, not 3 wells. So it's sort of like it is a more...
Right, but does Matt Vitale, where does he split up the division? Let's say that the 3 lots are 3 pieces of a pie. Does he put the well in the middle and split up the protective radius between the 3 lots?
So I think it's saying if Matt Vitale is the owner of 3 lots, Matt Vitale can't put a well on each lot and say, no, it's totally cool. Each of this is its own lot. If Matt Vitale is the only owner, then there is no semi-public water supply, nor is there a radius. It's just saying I can't put a well, if I'm owning all of these, or if I've subdivided my 10-acre parcel into an 8-acre parcel and a 2-acre parcel because I want to put water in the barn. I can't, again, so long as I own both of those properties, I can't kind of break it down that way and bypass the well regulation restriction. I don't think that that necessarily implies that that well or that scenario would be a semi-public water supply on those properties. I think it's slightly different in my opinion, but what do others think?
No, I agree. I think 7 is the idea of most of 7 is to just say you can't have more than one well serving yourself. It also says you can't have a well serving more than one dwelling without being a semi-private water supply. And so I think we're trying to cover both situations in which someone owns 3 lots, but they're serving one house, and the situation in which there are 3 lots being served by a single well, in which case it kicks over to the semi-public situation. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I guess so. I just wanted to, I thought that when I heard you guys talking about before, it seemed like there was an opportunity for someone to leverage, you know, section, well, the changes in 10 against the changes in the previous changes to 9. So, but that's,
No, I think
those are my
for-
only comments. Thank you for hearing me.
Thanks, Brian.
I think 10 is really just trying to avoid people having multiple wells
Yeah,
serving us when they only have one house. Does that make sense?
yes.
Perfect. Brian, thanks so much for your comments. And Daryl, I just, I want to make sure I understand. I think with the 100 feet, 100 feet is actually aligning the floor of semi-public with the floor of public. I don't think that we're saying
Yes.
semi-public has a lower floor than a public water supply, but rather that they have a common floor for that zone of protection.
Yes.
Do I have that right?
And
Okay.
yes, and it only takes, say, 1,300 gallons would be up to 117-foot radius. So it, you know, it rapidly rises from 1,000
Basically, anything
gallons.
more than 9 bedrooms being served by that water supply is going to raise above 100.
Yep.
Okay. Perfect. Any other public comment or question before we kind of close out to vote to finalize? Perfect. I don't see any hands up. Daryl, am I missing any that you're seeing?
I don't see any.
Perfect. So Ellen, do I need to have a motion to approve the language as amended as final? Is that what we need to have as the output for tonight?
Yep.
Perfect. Do I have a motion to approve the language as amended?
So moved.
Second.
Any further discussion? Hearing none.
Daryl, I.
Matt Beavers, aye.
Lisa, I.
Matt Vitale, aye. All right. I don't want to jinx myself, but I think we're just to the 329 agenda items. Is that what you think too, Ellen?
Yes.
Well, look at that. What do we have on the docket so far?
1 second, let me get that. Well, so far for March 29th, it's we have 1 variance hearing at 7:30, and then it's all Mark's business right now. He's got just 2 septic renewals, which will be very quick. The plans would just be expiring April 7th. If you don't renew them, there's no changes. Then he has updates, 1 for 13 Corsebrook Road, 1 for a status of 60 Brush Hill Road, a preliminary building application, and another preliminary building application review for 263 Western Ave.
Okay. So let's have those on the docket. And then I think that we're going to send the final proposed changes to town council. So let's have an agenda item for just any feedback or follow-up from the town council discussion
Okay.
for the proposed regulation changes. I don't intend to review them again, but just if there's any edits that come out of that discussion to be able to bring them back to the group. I think
Okay,
otherwise,
can-
oh, go ahead. Go ahead, Daryl.
I don't know if you're done writing that down, Ellen, but probably we could have some just mention of whatever happens with advisory this Saturday. on our budget.
Perfect. That sounds lovely.
We might also talk about the return to in-person meetings.
Okay.
If there are any issues with that, and I know that there are movements by various groups to try to extend the opportunity for remote meetings, given that
I certainly
I
think it
think
makes it
it's,
way more accessible, particularly in
Yeah.
a community like ours. Go ahead, Jeff.
Yeah, it's been, the governor needs to sign it, but the Mass House and Senate both approved a 2-year extension
Oh, good.
to the end of March 2025, and highly likely the governor will sign it. We're also pretty far along with hybrid capabilities, so if people wanted to do some in person, some via Zoom, that'll be, the technology is getting there. It's really the audio technology, so we've installed some new equipment.
Perfect. Thanks so much, Jeff. That's super helpful. All right. Ellen, if we've dotted our I's and crossed our T's and made enough trouble, is an appropriate time for us to adjourn?
Yeah, I think so.
Perfect. Do I have a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
second.
Jeff's clapping, so.
Ciao, guys.
Bye.
Night.
All right, Daryl, I.
Matt Beaver's eye.
Lisa, I.
Matt Vitale, aye. Have a great night, guys.
Good
Night,
night.
everyone.
Thank you.